Hello, I'm Laura Ellis, and I would like to welcome you to my session, Working with Teens in Times of Trauma through Reciprocal Mentorship. I'm here to let you know that all of us have been through a lot, and I want to give you some tools to help our students, our patrons, and our fellow staff members. Mentorship is when two or more people, work collaboratively in a mutual beneficial partnership where one person serves as the mentor, that's the expert, and the mentee, that's the person who's receiving instruction. And this is very important because that relationship is very supportive. There's many benefits to mentorship. Number one, it builds strong relationships. The mentee learns from an expert. The expert shares their expertise with someone, and finally, both the mentor and mentee grow from the experience. Reciprocal mentorship refers to the fact that in this relationship, both people involved will serve as the mentor and the mentee. The reason is we have all been traumatized, and we want to make sure that our fellow staff members have the support that they need, that we in turn can provide support to our students. I'm in a high school, so my students are teenagers. And for those of us in public libraries, how do we make sure we're serving and providing that extra layer of assistance to our teenage patrons? This is one particular way that this can happen, especially if we focus in on what it takes to build relationships. First of all, we have to realize that trauma is an unexpected event or series of events that creates great stress to the point at which a person is overwhelmed, even scared to death. I'll use the example of the death of George Floyd. That was a very traumatic event that was very difficult to witness. And another person described it as any type of interruption, unexpected interruption of our daily routine. So routines are very important, especially to young people. So why is this important? First of all of us have been traumatized by the events of last year and this year. And our teenage patrons and their families may be suffering from trauma and not even realize it. And as library and school personnel, we need to be able to support each other to support our patrons. And we can't keep giving. Sometimes we need to be filled and supported. So it's difficult. This is a very difficult thing that we're doing, but we're excited about it because we're slowly opening up our society and creating our new normal. Secondhand trauma is when someone witnesses or hears about someone else's trauma. So trauma is something that I experienced myself. So secondhand trauma is definitely witnessing George Floyd's death. So the initial trauma Mr. George Floyd experienced, he did not live through it, but us watching it is something that was very traumatizing for the country and the world. Historical trauma within the lens of the death of George Floyd is, unfortunately, African Americans have a history of police brutality. So I think that really led to other things that happened in the country, and it was something that happened over a long time, police brutality in this particular example. And the next example is accumulated and prolonged trauma. So after witnessing the death of George Floyd, then there were a number of protests and a number of other things that happened in the country that were very unsettling. And it happened a number of times over a number of months. Another example of accumulated and prolonged trauma is a child that's in a relationship with their parents that's abusive, or a wife in domestic violence. All of those are over a long period of time. And it's one trauma after the other. It can be very difficult for a person to overcome. What are the effects of trauma? All of these, anger, fear, rage, helplessness, anxiety, all of them are effects of trauma. And the last bullet point you see is suicidal ideation. The difficulty is, as we work with teenagers, we know that suicide rates among our teenagers were skyrocketing before the pandemic and just continue to skyrocket during the pandemic. So some of these things that you see here may also qualify as someone who's also having suicidal thoughts. So I've also done training and been in training to know the signs of suicide. And I have to admit, some of the signs of suicide are very close to the signs and effects of trauma. We may encounter students and teenage patrons who are suffering, and others who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I used to believe only people who served in the military suffered from PTSD. So when I started to learn more about trauma, I learned that anyone who has experienced a traumatic event could suffer from this disorder. And it can be a long time. It can happen. You can suffer from PTSD right after a traumatic event, or a traumatic event that was suppressed and starts to bother a person later. Each person is different, so it's very important as library personnel that we realize that people may be going through this. They were going through this before the pandemic, before we ever heard of COVID. People were suffering from this, but we weren't really talking about people suffering from PTSD, meaning everyday people. And we certainly weren't talking about it, to my knowledge, when it comes to teenagers. So it's very important that we realize that these things can be affecting the people who we're working for. So story-based trauma healing allows people to share their story. And it's very important that people are heard. And that is so that they can feel validated and move past their trauma. Please know that what I'm sharing with you is definitely for lay people and does not in any way replace the fact that some people may need professional help to overcome their trauma. So this does not replace people who need to seek professional help. This training is for lay people to support each other in our everyday lives. So how does it work? People usually work in pairs. All stories and discussions are confidential. There should be a specific time and place and be private and safe for the in person for the meeting. If it's on Zoom, it should be totally private and never recorded. And it usually happens when both people have mutual trust and respect for each other. And I'm going to stop here because as school personnel and perhaps as public library personnel, we have to make sure that our students and patrons are safe. So in our school district, we are not allowed to be anywhere alone with a student. So if I were to talk with a student one-on-one, I would definitely be in one of our classrooms or in my office where the windows are there. The door could be closed, but windows are open, blinds are open, and in plain sight of other professionals in the building. Unfortunately, there have been people who've taken advantage of our students, so we have to be very mindful that our students and our staff are always safe. And finally, the last bullet, a key component to this is active listening. So active listening means that we're fully engaged as the mentor, listening to the story of the mentee. Now, we have to be very aware that if we are people from different cultures and backgrounds, that what may be totally acceptable in one culture may not be acceptable in another culture. So that needs to be discussed as well. But eye contact, be aware of your facial expressions as the mentor and your body language. You don't want to be looking at them, may make the mentee, the person telling their story, feel uncomfortable. You may want to rephrase some of the things that they're saying to make sure that they know you're listening. And there's absolutely no judgment or criticism of what the mentee is saying. And it's not stated here. We're not here to solve the problem. We can't solve it. What we're going to do is help the mentee work through it to come to resolution. We should ask clarifying questions if we need to, show empathy and compassion. And it's very important that we don't talk about ourselves. When we're in the role of the mentor, that's what we're supposed to be doing, listening. When we talk about ourselves, that's when we're in the role of the mentee. And it's very important as the mentor that we help the mentee at the time identify the base of their emotion of the trauma. That's also essential. So how do we go about active listening? Now, I've made this mistake so many times. When I see students consistently, I would notice that something wasn't quite right, and I would say, "Are you okay? Is everything okay?" Horrible question to ask, because the children would just say, "Yeah, I'm fine," and they wouldn't tell me. So a better question is, "How are you feeling and what happened?" This establishes the facts and a timeline, and it gives the person an opportunity to be heard. "Hey, I see you're not quite yourself today. Is everything going well? Can you tell me what happened?" So I'm still struggling on how to engage the kids in a way that's meaningful and that don't give me that one word answer, but what happened is a great place to start. How did you feel? This establishes the level of emotions that the person had, and also naming those emotions puts boundaries around vague feelings. Until you have a conversation, you may not really understand how you feel. The mentee may not understand how they really feel until they're really talking about it. And it's extremely important that when you share, it's confidential and you trust each other. Can't emphasize that enough. The last question is, what was the hardest part for you? And this is so important for the mentor to establish that, because it helps the mentee dismantle that emotion and to go through the grieving process, which is difficult. And that going through the grieving process leads to healing and overcoming the trauma. And nobody likes to go through grief, but unfortunately, it's a part of life. So, trauma leads to grief because there's a loss, but not all grief is a result of trauma. So, anytime that there's an unexpected loss, that's considered grief by trauma. I love this diagram because when there's a trauma, it can be so deep, it hurts and wounds your heart. And from that heart wound, a person will experience deep, deep grief. But we have to remember that not all grief is caused by trauma. If my parent has lived a long life and they die peacefully in their sleep, I'm going to grieve, but it's not something that's, I want, but it's not like it's unexpected. If a person is never expected, you never want a person you love to die, but a person who's lived a long life versus a person who's dies very young, it's a different experience. Both are painful, but it's just different. So what happens as we grieve? About 1 month or longer, and every person is different. People may experience the fact that they're numb, they can't believe what's happened, they may start to cry or erupt in anger. And when we encounter our patrons, they may be expressing some of this, and we have to make sure we don't internalize it. They may be going through something very difficult and be acting in a way that they would not normally act. Also, they may be, why did this happen to me? They may have displaced anger and want to blame someone else for what they're going through. And also, it's very hard to absorb a loss. And anger is a big issue, and they may feel helpless as well. And we want to make sure we create an atmosphere where they have support, because it's very easy to become very overwhelmed. Also, after they get through that first stage, and everyone's different, we all go through, according to this model, the no hope phase, which is 6 to 15 months, but it could take longer, where people really, really feel hopeless. They don't know, how to behave. They may feel lonely. They may want to kill themselves or feel guilty. It's a difficult stage to be in, and it just takes its course, and we all face different variations of this. And it's a very dark place during the grieving process, and a person may feel like there's nothing good that will ever happen again. And this is so important that we understand what the grieving process is, even if we have difficulty identifying what stage a person is in, that we continue to provide support for anyone that's facing grief. And slowly, once that period of time is over, a new beginning may start, and we can help people with their new beginning. A good example of a new beginning is our everything's opening back up. We're slowly opening our libraries, we're slowly opening our schools, but there's also some anxiety about that because it may not be what it was before the pandemic. So we have to be prepared that even though we're opening, it may not meet our expectation, and that it's okay if people are a little anxious about it, a little upset, and to give people that room and space to express that in a constructive way. So we've talked about the first 4 steps of the story, trauma healing, and reciprocal mentorship. The 6th step is forgiveness, and that's an important step, to forgive the person who's offended, who made the offense, because if not, that could turn into bitterness, and it doesn't depend on that person. Reconciliation, rebuilding that relationship with that person, but that is not a requirement. Once you have forgiven that person, or once the mentee has forgiven that person, it doesn't mean they have to reestablish that relationship. It may not be safe to do so. It might be good that you're never in a relationship with that person again. And finally, all of us have an opportunity to have a new beginning. And that's where we as library staff and teachers come in. We can always assist our students in finding new information, new things, so they can move on with their lives. And finally, we all have to take advantage of self-care. We have to pay attention to what's going on with ourselves and take the time to take care of ourselves so we can be there for our fellow staff members, our patrons, and our students. I want to thank you so very much for being here with my session, and I hope you've learned a lot. It's a process that I'm continuing to learn about. Please take care, and thank you again.